Learning goal today is to discuss the importance of biodiversity and the current threats posed by anthropogenic activities. Biodiversity can be defined as all the variety of life in the world or in a particular habitat or ecosystem, or all the life on Earth from the smallest bacteria to the largest blue whale. When it comes to biodiversity, the tropics reign supreme. Between 70 and 80% of known species are located in the tropic, and worldwide, most of the known species are animals and most are terrestrial. There are many reasons to conserve biodiversity. These reasons can range from economic, ecological, social, and aesthetic reasons, and we're going to take a look at some ways that we can directly value biodiversity and then some ways that we can indirectly value biodiversity. We've talked about the idea of natural capital and natural income, which, remember, is the annual yield of goods and services available to us in the world, things such as mineral deposits, forests, fisheries, fertile soil, etc. Also, many of the medicines that we use are derived from nature, as well as many fertilizers and pesticides. Also, we can't forget about our food sources. Our food supply essentially all comes from other species, whether these are animals or plant species. Now let's take a look at some examples of indirect ways to value biodiversity. First one we've got here is called ecosystem maintenance. You can think of this as the maintaining of an ecosystem condition or the ecosystem's productivity. And a good example here is the aeration, the addition of oxygen to soils by worms. Without this feature, we could have a decrease in the productivity of organisms that live underground. A big one here that is overlooked quite often is the fertilization and pollination of most food crops, which depends on insects. We've got nutrient cycling and the recycling of materials needed by living things. For example, plants capture carbon and store it in their tissues, and they also release oxygen, which all organisms need for respiration. Lastly, we've got climate regulation. Rainforests help stabilize the world's climate by absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which, as we know by now, will reduce the enhanced greenhouse effect. And we should make sure that we can discuss the direct and indirect value of biodiversity. Think about the fact that 50% of tropical rainforests have been cleared by humans, taking into consideration the fact that between 70 and 80% of the known species exist in the tropical rainforests, and the fact that it is extremely important for climate regulation. What do you think this means for everything that lives there, also in other parts of the planet? Now we're going to take a look at some factors that help to maintain biodiversity. First of all, we've got ecosystem complexity. In general, the more complex an ecosystem is, the more resilient it is to setbacks. We can think about this in terms of food webs. The more complex a food web is, the more resilient it is to the loss of one species in that food web. If one type of food source is lost, the others will tend to fill in the gaps. The next factor that we can take a look at is what stage of succession the ecosystem is. Remember, when plants and animals first colonize a bare piece of rock or land, there are relatively few species colonizing it at first. But as succession continues, the species diversity increases with time until a climax community is reached. And remember, once that climax community is reached, the biodiversity may fall slightly, but it often then stabilizes, and we can just generalize this as saying that as ecological succession continues forward, the biodiversity tends to increase. Here we've got a picture of the stages of succession, beginning here with our bare rock. At these early stages, we have relatively low biodiversity, and once we reach our climax community, the biodiversity has greatly increased. The last factor that maintains biodiversity that we're going to take a look at here is the availability of limiting factor. In general, if there are plentiful amounts of limiting factors available in an ecosystem, the ecosystem tends to be more resilient. Down here at the bottom, we've got some examples: water, food, space, nutrients. And what this is saying is if these factors are available in abundance, if there are a lot of these, then the ecosystem can react in a positive way to the decrease in any one of these different factors. But if we had a situation, for example, in the desert where water is very limiting, any decrease in any of these other factors could potentially put species in the desert at risk. And we should make sure that we can describe at least 3 things that help maintain biodiversity. Next, we're going to take a look at some threats to biodiversity, or some factors that could lead to the loss of biodiversity. First one we've got here is natural hazards. These are naturally occurring events that can negatively impact the environment. Oftentimes, when the natural hazard impacts humans greatly in a negative way, the major effect of natural hazards and natural disasters on biodiversity is the loss of habitat. But remember, habitat destruction and degradation can also occur when humans develop or build on pieces of land. Some examples of natural hazards are volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, floods, wildfires, and hurricanes. Make sure you can outline how natural hazards may result in a loss of biodiversity. Habitat loss is the largest single cause to the loss of biodiversity. Like we just talked about, humans are responsible for destroying or changing most of the ecosystems in the world. Just as a quick analogy, imagine that the current residents of Fairfield could only live within the Fairfield city limits, and then if we destroyed half of Fairfield, what would happen to the population that was living there? These places are just a few of the examples where humans have destroyed or changed almost all of the original natural habitat. The Philippines, Vietnam, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, in the Mediterranean, and also in Madagascar. In all of these places, the human population density is really high, and because of this, most of the wildlife habitat and most of the rainforest in these areas have already been lost. Be sure that we can explain how habitat loss is affecting biodiversity. The next factor that can threaten biodiversity is called habitat fragmentation. This is the process where a large habitat area can be divided into like a patchwork of fragments. These fragments are typically separated from each other by things like roads, towns, factories, fences, power lines, pipelines, or large fields. This causes an area that was once a large habitat to become like a series of small islands. You may have seen a group of turkeys running across a road from one field to the next. Think about the turkey's original habitat. It was once a large area, and it's become divided by these roads that the turkeys now have to run across. And of course, what this fragmentation does is it exposes these organisms to more hazards. It increases a concept called the edge effect. And if you think about an ecosystem, the fluctuation in the ecosystem's biotic and abiotic factors increases at the edges. So there's more variability in these factors around the edges of the ecosystem. So the more fragments you have in a habitat, the more edges you're going to have, and this causes more fluctuations in the biotic and abiotic factors of that ecosystem, which reduces the stability of the ecosystem. The more fragments of an ecosystem you have, the less and less protected area inside of the habitat of the ecosystem exists, and this allows more opportunities for invasive species and the spread of disease, for example, within that habitat and the ecosystem. This diagram does a pretty good job of explaining the edge effect. This lighter green area is indicating the width of the edge of the ecosystem that is affected by factors that are housed outside of the ecosystem. The darker green area here is the area of the ecosystem that is not influenced by the edge effects. So if you just envisioned a road running here, the edge of the ecosystem on each side of the road is influenced more by that road than the interior of the habitat. As you have an increased fragmentation of habitats, the size of the fragments becomes increasingly smaller, but the width of the edge and those edge effects remains constant, even as you decrease the size of the fragments. So these numbers here indicate the percentage of the habitat patch that is influenced and negatively affected by the edge effects. Here we have 30%, Here we have about 44%, and as the fragments become smaller and smaller, the percentage of the edge effect increases in those fragments. So we should make sure we can explain how habitat fragmentation threatens biodiversity. Next, we've got pollution and overexploitation of natural resources. Of course, pollution caused by human activities can degrade or destroy habitats, making them increasingly unsuitable to support the range of species that reside in that area. We've talked a lot about this. Also, overexploitation. We've talked about the fact that as human populations have expanded and technology has improved, this has allowed us to get better and better at catching organisms for food supplies, hunting them, harvesting these natural resources, and it has allowed us to exploit the environment at a more efficient pace. So again, we've talked a lot about both of these, just wanted to make sure it was in here. Be sure we can explain how pollution and overexploitation threaten biodiversity. Next, we've got the introduction of non-native or invasive species to an area. This includes the human introduction of a new species to an area where it doesn't usually belong. Oftentimes this can happen by accident. Typically this new introduced species has no natural predators in an area and it begins to reproduce rapidly. The fast-growing invasive species population can take resources from species who share a similar niche as that organism, and the native species is often outcompeted and may die out over time and become extinct. Invasive species often have features that allow them to be more efficient in a new environment than organisms that already live there. A couple local examples here of invasive species. The first one is the European grapevine moth. This moth was introduced in 2009 into the Napa County vineyards, and it's unknown how it got there. It was particularly damaging to the Napa County vineyards as the insect's larvae feeds on the grape bud clusters as well as the developing fruit of the grapes. Introduced in 2009, the population numbers of the European grapevine moth exploded and reached a peak the next year in 2010. It was, however, declared eradicated in 2016 in one of the most successful invasive species eradication stories of all time. And how they were able to do that was by quarantining many grapevine fields as well as a combination of pesticides and a lab-created pheromone that didn't allow the male moths to find their female counterparts, which caused them to not be able to mate and produce more larvae. Another example is a fungal disease called sudden oak death. This is a tree disease that was introduced to California and Oregon in the mid-1990s. It's thought that this disease was accidentally introduced to California forests by plants brought over from Europe as nursery trees. The disease is very effective at killing certain oak species such as coastal live oak, and it's devastated the number of these trees found in coastal forests in California and Oregon. Other examples include Dutch elm disease, which was imported to Europe from American logs and has been very efficient at decimating elm tree populations in Europe. The continent of Australia has had a particularly difficult time with invasive species. Some examples of organisms that have been introduced there that they've had a tough time eradicating are rabbits, cane toads, red foxes, and camels. The reason for that is that Australia has very distinct flora and fauna that's not found anywhere else on Earth, and the organisms that live there were highly adapted to this ecosystem. But this led them to be unable to compete with more aggressive invasive species. Make sure we can explain how invasive species threaten local populations. Now we're going to take a quick look at a special case, which is the rainforest. We just talked about how 50% of tropical rainforests have been cleared by humans. Tropical rainforests are of extreme importance. Consider the fact that rainforests contain roughly 50% of all the known species, but only cover about 6% of the land on Earth. They also produce about 40% of the oxygen that animals use, which is why they're often sometimes called the lungs of the Earth. Tropical rainforests have extremely high species and habitat diversity. A biodiversity hotspot is an area with extremely high diversity that is being destroyed by humans. To be considered a biodiversity hotspot, an area must meet two criteria. Many of the species that live in an area need to be endemic to only that area. That means they cannot be found anywhere else on Earth, and 70% of the area's vegetation has been lost by human activity. This map shows many of the world's biodiversity hotspots. Overall, there are 36 areas found around the world that meet the two criteria to become a biodiversity hotspot. Some of the most important biodiversity hotspots are the Caribbean islands, the Atlantic forests in Brazil, Southeast Asia, the Philippines, the Horn of Africa, Madagascar, and the California coast. Getting back to the rainforest, around 2 billion people live in the tropics, and they rely on the productivity and sustainability of the rainforest for survival. The threats posed to the tropical rainforests are not only threats to these people who live there, but they're also threats to everyone on Earth. Like we said earlier, 40% of the oxygen that's used by animals is created in the tropical rainforest. We should make sure that we can explain why the threats to the rainforest are especially concerning. So how are threats to biodiversity monitored? The IUCN is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, but it's often just called the World Conservation Union. This is an international agency which was founded in 1948, which brought together 83 states, 110 government agencies, more than 800 non-governmental organizations, we call these NGOs, and about 10,000 scientists and experts, all from about 181 countries overall. I'll go ahead and read the union's mission statement. It is to influence, encourage, and assist societies throughout the world to conserve the integrity and diversity of nature and to ensure that any use of natural resources is equitable and ecologically sustainable. One piece of literature that the IUCN creates that we've probably heard of is the endangered species list. So guys, as you can see, the next thing that you're going to be doing there is the summary, but I want to talk real quick. If you flip your packet all the way over to the backside, there's an assignment that we're going to be working on after you get done with this summary. So with regard to the endangered species list, within a single ecosystem, some species within that ecosystem are more vulnerable than others. Before you get to the chart, you're going to fill out the definition for the minimum viable population size. That can be found on page 173 right there in the middle of the page. Then for each factor influencing a species' vulnerability to extinction, you're going to fill out a description of the factor, and you're going to write down the examples of that factor found in this section. And that'll be the end of the notes for today.